everyone, Back Photography here, back with another video, so thank you for joining me once again. Today is all about sharpness, and we're going to be talking a lot about how you can get the sharpest portraits possible out of your camera. We're going to be looking at a few different tips and tricks you can use in camera to get the sharpest image possible. Then we're also going to go into Photoshop and look at a few ways that you can use post-production to make your photos look more sharp as well. We're also going to be looking at the difference between sharpness and contrast, and talking about why you need to have a good contrast in your image for it to look nice and sharp. So let's get some of the more obvious reasons an image isn't sharp, and then we'll move on to more and more technical stuff as we go on in this video. The first thing is you should keep your camera as still as possible when you're hitting that shutter button, because when you hit the shutter button, you're actually sending a shockwave through the camera from the action of pressing that button. Any motion you make in the camera while you're shooting is going to be picked up in the image, particularly when you're shooting at low shutter speeds. Also, your focus point is going to change when you move the camera even slightly, so you're not going to get the sharpest image possible if your camera moves at all while you're taking the photo. Make sure you keep the camera super still by holding at least one of your elbows into your body while you're holding the camera, so that when you take a photo with that shutter button, the shake is minimal in your camera. And actually, we can get rid of this problem completely with the next tip, which is to never just take one photo by itself when you're doing portraits. And this is particularly important when shooting handheld because of the problem we just discussed before. If you're shooting multiple photos at once, let's say 2 or 3, the second and third photo aren't going to suffer from you pressing the shutter button, because you're only pressing it the first time if you're shooting in continuous shooting mode. And that means that the second and third photo are going to be much sharper than the first one, because they don't have to worry about the camera shake and the motion blur from the camera shake. Now, you're still going to have problems with the focus on the second and third photo if you move the camera by pressing the shutter button, but at least the motion blur problem from the camera shaking is removed. The next tip is to always have your shutter speed fast enough so that you're not getting any motion blur in your photos from your camera moving around or your model moving around. So a handy tip is to always think of shooting about double the inverse of your focal length. So for example, if you're shooting on a 50mm lens, always shoot at 1/100th or faster. Or if you're shooting on an 85mm lens, always shoot at least 1/170th of a second. And this pretty much works for any focal length bigger than about 50mm. If you're shooting at a wider angle like 35 or 24, it's going to be worth still shooting at least at 1/160th of a second, so that you don't get any blur from your model moving or from you moving the camera when you take the photo. And while we're talking about camera settings, let's talk about 2 more tips, about 2 more parts of your camera settings that are really going to make a difference in how sharp your photos are. The first one is the ISO, and shooting at the right ISO to get the cleanest image you can with the least amount of noise. When you boost the ISO up, you're going to add a lot of grain to your image, and that's going to reduce the sharpness of the final product. Now, sometimes you have to turn the ISO up if you're shooting in low light, but try to keep this as low as you possibly can so that you're not adding noise into your image. You can see in these 2 photos that the one with the low ISO is much sharper and has a much more detailed image. When you're shooting at ISO of 5000, even in a really nice day where the light is super soft and there aren't any harsh highlights or deep shadows, you can still see a lot of noise. I try not to let my ISO go up at all unless I really have to use it. And even then, I really don't shoot portraits at above about 640 ISO with my Sony a7R II camera. So try to keep your ISO at the native ISO 100 or 200 depending on your camera, and only bring it up if you really need to in those low light situations. My next tip is that you don't always have to shoot at the lowest aperture that your camera provides in portraits. Now, this is something I don't really follow. I like shooting at super low apertures so I can get beautiful out of focus backgrounds, but it's not the best way to get super sharp images, because your camera lens is probably not at its sharpest at the maximum aperture. Most prime lenses are their sharpest around f5.6 to f7.1 depending on the architecture of the lens, and you can actually see that as you go lower in aperture and then also really high in the aperture range, you start getting diffraction in the high end, and then also you start to lose the focus and get some softer images in that low aperture range as well. So when you're shooting at f1.4, f1.8, you can't expect to get the sharpest of the sharp images, but you still can get really sharp images as long as you follow the previous tips I've just talked about. So before we keep going with these tips, let's have a quick recap of what we've thought about so far. The first thing is to keep your camera really still when you're taking the photo to reduce the motion blur as much as possible. Then you want to put your camera on continuous shooting mode and shoot multiple photos at once, so that the initial press on that shutter button is removed from the equation when we're looking at the second and third photo. Then we're going to be using a fast shutter speed to remove any motion blur from any camera shake that remains and also the movement in your subject. We're going to be shooting at a low ISO so that we have a clean, crisp image and the sensor is getting the best quality signal from all the exposure going into the camera. And finally, use your camera's sharpest aperture, normally around 5.6 to 7.1, if you want to get the sharpest image possible. So if you're enjoying this content so far, please consider subscribing and also hitting the like button so that I can release more content for you and make this into my full-time job. I really appreciate all of you who subscribe, so thank you very much. Before we go into Photoshop and have a look at the ways you can make your photos more sharp there, let's look at one final tip you can do in camera to make your photos look more sharp. And that is to consider that the closer you are to your subject, the less things are going to be in focus and the thinner your depth of field is going to be. So if you're shooting at f1.4 and you're really close to your subject, you can be so shallow in your depth of field that not even their entire eye is in focus. So maybe only their eyelashes are in focus, or maybe even just parts of their iris are in focus. So if you're shooting really close up, this is also going to be affected by your focal length as well. So if you're shooting on a really long lens, like an 85 or a 135, it's going to have an even shallower depth of field. So if you're shooting really close up, consider stopping down your aperture a little bit. You can still get really blurry out of focus backgrounds and not have to worry about having such a razor-sharp depth of field that you can't get enough things in focus for the photo to look pleasing. So here we are in Photoshop, and let's have a look at some ways that we can make this photo look more sharp. And the first thing that I always like to do is get a nice contrast level in the photo. Now, contrast and sharpness are not the same thing, but having contrast and having the right amount of highlights and shadows makes your image look more bold, and that in turn is going to make it look sharper in general. So you can see here that in the hair it's very gray, and that's because we're shooting into the sun here and the camera is reducing the contrast in the entire image so we can retain some detail because that harsh light is coming straight at us. So what we can do is actually bring back some of the contrast by either pulling up the contrast with the slider right here, which is something I don't normally do. I actually like to use the clarity slider because then we're only boosting the midtone contrast and we're not making the whites and highlights or the blacks really deep. So this is a much better way in my opinion. So boosting the clarity, you can already see in the eyes and also in the hair, you get a really big difference. Now you don't want to go crazy with this because you still want to make it look reasonably natural, but just adding a little bit of clarity in there really does help. So that's the first thing I would do to this image to make it more sharp. The next thing I would do is just get the brush tool and paint in any areas that are looking low contrast. So we're still talking about contrast right now. We're going to move on to sharpening as well, but it's all very important to get a sharp image that everything is colorful, everything is punchy in the right places, and that's what we're going to do first in this photo. So I'm going to add a little bit of clarity and I'm going to add a little bit of the shadows as well. And then I'm just going to paint in here the area that isn't looking deep contrast enough. So we can do a couple of passes. I'm just going to do a rough one for this video, but you can see here already it's making a big difference. And I'm also going to do a little bit there and also just on her dress here as well. So you can already tell that there's a huge difference in the before and after of this photo. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually find where it's in focus, and you can see this image is incredibly sharp, looking very good. Even though it was low contrast, we've got a lot of detail here, and this is at f1.4 as well. So the main focus of this photo is of course Tylicia's face here. So we're going to actually make it a little bit brighter to give the illusion of sharpness. So I'm going to add a little bit of exposure and a little bit of clarity and just paint that into the eyes here and here. Now you don't want to go crazy with this because if you do, it's going to start looking kind of strange, but just adding a little bit here of exposure and clarity, and then maybe just dropping the shadows very slightly to make the eyes nice and punchy. And for portraits, I like to do this as well for the eyelashes as well, just adding a little bit more darkness, the nostrils, and then also inside the mouth as well. Okay, so that's everything for that. The next thing I like to do to make an image appear more sharp is add some vibrance to the entire photo. And that's just making the colors more punchy so that you can see the difference in colors and the contrast in colors around the image. And contrast in color is also going to make something look more sharp. So that's everything for Camera Raw for now. Now we're going to talk a little bit about sharpness itself, and there is a sharpening tool just here. And when you use the sharpening tool, it's basically just adding in contrast as well. So I'll go over to the eyelashes here, and I'm just going to go crazy with this just so you can kind of tell what's going on. It's just changing how deep the colors and the darkness is. So as you can see, as I go crazy, you can kind of tell what's going on here. So it's making the lights really bright, it's making the dark colors really dark, and it's making the colorful colors really colorful. So let's just get rid of that. We just want to add in, just a little bit like that, and then also maybe underneath here as well, and then go to the other eye and just add in a little bit there as well, and also in the eyelashes too. So now let's zoom out. You can really see the eyes are starting to pop, and it's looking super, super sharp. Okay, so what else can we do to make this image appear more sharp? Well, one thing we can do is make it blurrier in the places that aren't important. So if I make a selection of Tylisha here, like so, and then go select inverse, and then filter blur, you can choose whichever blur you like, but I like the Gaussian blur, and just add a pixel in here and there. You are making the background much blurrier in comparison to Tylisha, which in turn is making her appear more sharp. So that's another trick that you can do to make your focus much more sharp in your image. And here's a quick before and after, and you can really see the big difference that adding a bit of sharpness and some contrast and some clarity really makes to the entire photo. So I just want to finish this video by saying it doesn't actually matter that much if your photos aren't super, super sharp. There's a lot of other things to consider to take a beautiful portrait. Things like the composition and where the lighting is, and the settings in your camera like the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and a whole bunch of other things, location, everything like that, posing. There's so many other things to consider. So if you're not able to get your photos looking super, super sharp, even after all of these tips and tricks, don't worry about it too much. It takes a little bit of practice, and there are other things to do to make a photo look amazing. So that's everything for this video. I really hope that you liked watching it, and let me know what you think of this final photo. There's going to be a link to the raw files from this photo shoot if you would like to have an edit of any of these photos, or if you'd like to go back and edit along to that part of the video I just showed you. If you do decide to edit any of these photos, I really enjoy seeing all the edits that you guys do over on Instagram. So that's everything for now from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.